Okay, so good morning, everyone. I wish you a warm welcome at this panel organized by the Observatoire de la Finance on the topic, can sustainable finance break the tragedy of horizons? As you may know, the term tragedy of horizons was coined in 2015 by Mark Carney, who was at the time governor of the Bank of England. He created this concept to explain how the impact of climate change will impose a cost on future generations that the current generation has no incentive to fix. So today we're going to discuss whether the trend of sustainable finance can contribute to break this tragedy of horizons. To do that, I'm pleased to welcome a fantastic panel of who unfortunately, given the circumstances, could not be here on site in person. However, we have decided to maintain our session online. Hopefully it's working. So me, I'm Virgile Perret, and I will be moderating this session. I am from the Observatoire de Finance. And now let me introduce our guest speakers. So Stefano Battiston, he's Associate Professor in Sustainable Finance and Networks at the University of Zurich. He's one of the leading scholars in the field of network models and systemic risk and sustainable finance. He has made advances in the scientific understanding of the relation between financial interconnectedness, complexity, and risk. Then we have Alina Mika on the left. She's an associate economist at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Her work is centered on maximizing the impact of the bank's sustainable finance initiatives. She has previously worked in central banking and economic consulting, and she's also one of the winners of the 8th edition of the Global Prize Ethics and Trust in Finance for a Sustainable Future, organized by the Observatoire de la Finance. Thierry Philippona is a member of the board of the French Financial Markets Authority and a member of the Sanctions Committee of the French banks and insurance companies. He's also a member of the European Commission Technical Expert Group on Sustainable Finance. And since 2019, he works at Finance Watch as head of research and advocacy. Christophe Revelli is a professor of sustainable finance and impact finance at Ketch Business School. He's the holder of the research chair Finance Reconsidered, Addressing Sustainable Economic Development. And he founded in 2016 and managed during 6 years the first European master fully dedicated to the integration of sustainable issues and criteria into financial decisions. And finally, Jean-Philippe Svoronos, he's from the Bank of International Settlement. He joined the Financial Stability Institute of the BIS in 2003, and he's a senior financial sector specialist and member of the Financial Stability Institute Connect team. So welcome to everyone, and thank you very much for your patience and availability. So I will start with a question to Thierry. The tragedy of horizons refers to a mismatch between the long-term goal of sustainability and the short-term focus in financial activities. So can the current trend of sustainable finance, for example, ESG investing, contribute to address this challenge, or are we deluding ourselves? Thierry, up to you.
Thank you very much, Virgile. First, allow me to thank you and thank Observatoire de la Finance for organizing this. I think this is a very important discussion. And the angle taken, breaking the tragedy of the horizons, beyond the fact that, it's a well-known sentence now, still needs to be addressed. So in my view, it's really the right angle. So I'm very pleased and honored to be speaking with you this morning. Just very briefly also, you kindly introduced me with, describing the several hats I may be wearing, and I am wearing. Just to make things clear, I'm speaking on behalf of Finance Watch this morning, and as the head of research and advocacy of Finance Watch. This is the only mandate for which I have a mission to speak, and so this is what I'm doing now. I like your question. And I think it all comes down to what we collectively as a system are trying to do today in sustainable finance. Basically, we're taking finance, the traditional financial industry as I could describe it briefly, and we're trying to add a sustainable finance layer on top of the traditional way of functioning of the finance industry. And obviously that has some results. Obviously this is changing the game, but at the same time, it develops some internal contradiction that we need to face very clearly if we want to address the fundamental issue, which is, can sustainable finance make a difference? And the most fundamental issue is that the traditional way of working of finance in general and investment in financial markets in particular is that finance is supposed to be neutral. Neutrality of finance is a big theme, in terms of, regardless of which activity you're financing, regardless of your time horizon, time horizon, we're going to the, breaking the tragedy of the horizons here, whether you go long or short a particular financial instrument, that's neutral. Everything is on the same footing. Well, obviously, sustainable finance is about something different. And as we know, certainly, not only in the EU, but in China, in Russia, in Canada today, and the US is starting as well. There's a big effort to define what a sustainable economic activity is. The so-called taxonomies. There are many taxonomies being developed throughout the world with different degrees of maturity, but there are many efforts. And obviously, developing a taxonomy, which is at the end of the day a classification of economic activities, saying, okay, this activity is sustainable or not, and on which criterion, goes against the principle of neutrality of finance. So, we have an internal contradiction here that is not going to be easy to solve. But another principle of the neutrality of finance is the question of time horizons. And that has not been challenged at all, which means that effectively today, and if I think EU, and as you said, I'm a member of the platform on sustainable finance of the European Commission, working on finalizing the EU taxonomy of sustainable activities. I'm not speaking on with that hat on, but still, I have, I see what's going on there. Effectively, what the EU is doing today is that it is saying that any financial instrument linked to a sustainable activity will be considered as sustainable. But when we think about it, the one topic that is never addressed is that there are two conceptions of sustainable finance. One conception is that through a financial instrument or a financial product, there's some nuances there, but I'm not sure we want to go into that now, you can acquire an exposure to the variation of the price of an asset. And one conception of sustainable finance is that if you're exposed to the variation of the price of an asset, of a sustainable asset, an asset deemed to be stable thanks to the proper taxonomy, let's assume, the topic of the taxonomy is under control. It's very complex and far from being the case, but let's assume it is the case. Then you're doing sustainable finance because you're exposed to variation of that asset price. Another conception of sustainable finance is bringing capital to companies, to enterprises, to entities that will invest into a sustainable world, and not only invest in something that is green today, but will make the world evolve from where it is today, which in very short is not sustainable. The IPCC is very clear on that, to a world that tomorrow hopefully will be sustainable. And there is a big ambiguity in all the agenda as to which conception of sustainable finance we're talking about. The result of that is that today, the trend we're seeing is that if you invest into an ETF, exchange traded fund, or you get exposure through a total return swap on an activity deemed as sustainable thanks to the EU taxonomy, not in place yet, but coming soon, hopefully, then you will be considered as doing sustainable finance. But let me ask a question. Do we really believe that buying an exchange traded fund, holding it for, let's assume 24 hours or a week or even a month, and then selling it will change anything to the sustainability of the world and bring capital to those enterprises who are trying to invest to transition the world from an unsustainable position to a sustainable position? And the answer, as far as I'm concerned, is no. We can develop on that, but I probably don't have the time now. But I think if we want to break the tragedy of the horizons, we have to make this very, very clear. So what I'm calling for here is really to have, at the end of the day, a taxonomy of financial instruments. And now people are going to say, hey, yet again, another taxonomy. Well, yes, perhaps, but at least we should classify which instruments have the ability to have an impact on the world and which ones do not have that ability. There's no moral judgment in that. There's no good or bad. It's just a fact. It's purely factual. And this is very, very important. And the other thing, and I'll stop here because I don't want to be too long, is that the other side of the coin of sustainable finance is obviously the issuer side, the enterprise side. And this is called, certainly in the EU context, sustainable corporate governance. And sustainable corporate governance is about defining the right incentives and obligations of issuers and companies to act in a sustainable manner. Very long topic, but it is proving extremely controversial in the EU. And there was actually an announcement today that the project is being delayed again. It was due to be on the table in the EU last June. Then we heard that it would be on the table more or less now, end of this year. And we heard this morning that it's not going to be until next March. And what we're seeing here is a huge lobbying pressure from companies who effectively, let's call a spade, do not want to have incentives or obligations to act in a sustainable manner. So, you know, if we want to break that tragedy of the horizons, we also have to solve the other side of the coin, as I was calling it, which is the sustainable corporate governance dimension. I'll stop here for the sake of not being too long.
Thank you, Thierry. Thank you for this insight on this ambiguity in sustainable finance. Now I will turn to Stefano. I would like to ask you a question about the term tragedy used in this expression. Is it a correct diagnosis? What would be the consequences of a failure to overcome the tragedy of horizon? Is it really a tragedy? What do you think?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Stefano Battistone from University of Zurich and University of Venice. So this is also a very interesting question. So, well, we know that the tragedy of the horizon is a variant of the notion of tragedy of the commons. It's a widely used concept in economics. It denotes a situation in which some agents that are acting in a non-coordinated way on the basis of self-interest end up depleting their common resources. So what are the consequences? Well, the recent assessment report 6, the first working group of the IPCC, has documented what are the consequences in terms of physical phenomena, and they have to do essentially with more extreme meteorological events, but more importantly, possible irreversible changes in the climate system. And that, for example, means breakdown of the Gulf Stream, collapse of certain ecosystems, desertification of certain areas, and so on. So there are economic consequences of not mitigating climate change. Well, even if we mitigate climate change, there will be some consequences, but less severe. Estimating those consequences in economic terms is subject to some uncertainty, and that's the nature of the problems, nothing we can do about it. But I think what is important to understand is that there is a broader set of consequences on well-being of people. So I don't have time to expand much, but in short, life will be harder in many geographical areas, and importantly, conflicts will be more likely in a world in which we do not mitigate climate change. And this raises an important point for our panel today, because sustainable finance is usually defined as a practice, as essentially the attempt to include sustainability objectives in financial investment decisions. But from what I just said, these sustainability objectives are a question of values, essentially, or social, ethical. It's about what future do we want? What future are we willing to impose, or do we want to impose to future generations? So ultimately, this is a social, it's a political decision. It's definitely not a question that finance can address. And related to that, market disclosure, having more disclosure on climate-related investments, it will not suffice to get clarity on this. So as we get more clarity on what kind of future society wants to pursue, there will be policy decisions that will emerge. Some are already emerging, and these policy decisions modify the risk-return profile of financial assets. And some examples are the EU taxonomy, which Thierry mentioned, which is not directly about risk, but obviously modifies the risk-return profile and the attractiveness of certain assets. In Europe, another very important one is the 2050 roadmap, which sets the long-term trajectory. So today, the gap to be closed by in the area of sustainable finance is essentially between today's investments, and many of them are already labeled as ESG. It's almost about 30%, and the investments that are needed in order to reach a sustainable future according to what definition of sustainability society will agree upon.
Thank you very much, Stefano, for this insight. I think your point on the values, what we want as a society, and the connection to ethics in finance is important and very interesting. So now, Christophe, does the challenge of the tragedy of horizons require a change of paradigm? And I would ask, is the trend of sustainable finance a step in the right direction? What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, thank you, Virgil. First, good morning, everybody. Thank you to the Observatoire de la Finance for this invitation and this opportunity to debate together around this topic, quite important stuff. So I'm going to be in the same line as Thierry and Virgil. I think I'm going to not to try to repeat the same things, but also to bring my vision to this debate. So to answer this question, Virgil, I think that I could say that we need effectively a shift in the paradigm, definitively. When we say that, now the question is now how and why. And if we look at the neoclassical paradigm, neoclassical paradigm, it's based on hypothesis saying that reality are markets, they are efficient, the price is the only signal that must be considered. Regulation is a poison, and the only way to reach the collective welfare is to maximize the shareholder value. So according to this paradigm, since now 50, 60 years, externalities as CSR or sustainability have to be considered until the moment they don't modify the objective of business and performance. And now when we look to sustainable finance practices now, and we can observe that they are based on the same roots and paradigm than classical finance. Why? Because sustainable finance actors and corporates look at first their performance of their investment. If a sustainable investment is not profitable, they won't go generally. So just take an example. Just imagine that you could, what could be the decision of investment if you have a high interest to develop a project socially, for example, but that you have in the same time negative cash flow during 10 years. So what could be the decision? I think you need to consider that if it's negative during 10 years, are we sure that we want to invest in this project? I'm not sure, but And why do they look, second time, why do they look specifically at the performance? Because it's their fiduciary duty. That's to manage risk and performance for their clients and their shareholders. That's the job of finance today. So even if you are in sustainable finance industry, you have to manage this kind of stuff and for it to do the same things. Third, sustainable actors discount cash flows. And when we talk about temporality and tragedy of horizons, discounting is one of the stuff that we have to talk about. And investors want to consider if climate or sustainable issues are profitable now, with generally very high discounting rates. So that means that finally climate or sustainability are just short-term considerations and not specifically embedded into a long-term vision it needs. So finally, I think that we can say that the toolbox used for sustainable finance is clearly the same that for classical finance, especially if we look at the accountability first, that is based on IFRS and cash flow producing with discounting. Also, if we look at risk assessment modeling, using, for example, Brownian movement or distribution, that doesn't integrate the influence of extreme values, for example, and complex random situations. So risk assessment modeling is the same in sustainable finance as in classical finance. Also, if we look at financial performance indicators that are the same, benchmarking, risk-return optimization process, passive management portfolio strategies, for example, with ETF products, as Thierry said, financial data and regulation, all those practices and tools used in finance are also used in sustainable finance in a mimetic process, as sustainable finance is part of the financial industry, finally. So in this perspective, we can consider that ESG is considered as a variable of adjustment of cash flows, of pricing, but the finality is generally still the same. So it's to identify new risk or opportunities to generate businesses and finally opening new markets. One good example, and I will finish on that, one good example could be to look at the market of green bonds. If we look about green bonds and sustainable bonds to reach the sustainable finance gap, that is really huge. If we look at green bonds, they are priced finally the same way as classical bonds. The requirements to provide impact information are not specifically compulsory, and they are far from the sustainable finance gap. So if you look at the global bond market, only 1% of the global bond market is considered today as green or sustainable. And half of this 1% has no real green impact identified nor green asset backed. So it means that we can have another example. The last study published by Carbon Disclosure Project, CDP, in 2021. So relying that less than 1% of the funds worldwide are aligned with the Paris Agreement objectives. And they are more today positioned on the trajectory of plus 2.75 degrees. So it means that we are really far from the objectives in terms of practices. And that's why I think that's the shift of paradigm is necessary. So to conclude on this question, I think that the toolbox used for sustainable finance is not the good one to challenge the tragedy of horizons. Until the moment we don't modify the paradigm, considering the cost and depreciation and nature and accountability, modifying risk assessment modeling, try to avoid discounting also and consider long-term quality aligned with climate resilience and objectives. If we don't do this kind of things, I'm afraid that sustainable finance won't be achieved and aligned with expectation we fixed, but it's just my single opinion.
Thank you, Christophe. Now I would like to extend a bit our horizon precisely with a question to Alina from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, because sustainable finance is developing at fast pace in not only in Geneva but in developed economies. But is sustainable finance also growing in developing economies? And if yes, in what form and what are the specific challenges in those regions? Alina, please.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much for the invitation. It's really great to be here. I think that low-income countries are facing a slightly different version of the tragedy of the horizon. As you said, in developed countries, we have this trade-off between short-term returns and the more long-term consequences of climate change, the worst of which we haven't seen yet. But I think poorer countries have many different competing priorities in the short, medium, and longer term. Some countries are still very much focused on poverty eradication, on improving the quality of their institutions. And now Many of them are dealing with the consequences of the pandemic, which, as we know from the IMF, have been worse for poorer countries than for developed countries. So I think for this reason, in many parts of the world, the prospects of the worst consequences of climate change seems even further away, even though many of the lower income countries may be impacted very severely. And we've all heard about the $100 billion pledge, whereby developed economies promise to help poorer countries deal with the green transition. And this did help mobilize climate finance for developing countries over time. But despite the pledge, and as we have seen at the COP in Glasgow, the $100 billion target per year was not met. In fact, we were about 20% short, according to calculations from the OECD, which has been tasked with kind of keeping track of this target. And it's unlikely that $100 billion a year is even enough. I mean, I think best estimates are, in the trillions per year by the end of 2030. But regardless of, the precise calculations, the precise maths, what is clear is that we're far from the goal of supporting lower income countries, which historically have had a lower contribution to the CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere. So I think now, importantly, only around 20% of the roughly $80 billion the developed world gathered for the purposes of the transition in poorer countries in 2019 came from private sources. So it's quite clear that in many parts of the world, sustainable finance largely means debt and grants. And these are often provided by multilateral development banks and bilateral donors. And I get the impression that private investors are, increasingly happy to pursue green investments. They have been happy to invest in some poorer countries for a while, but climate finance for poorer countries is not really happening much at scale. And it's not hard to find reasons why this is the case when we consider risk-adjusted returns. I mean, poorer countries continue to have more unstable legislative environments, possibly shakier political situations, and investors just don't feel comfortable with the level of risk they'd be taking on. But it's also true that I think climate risks are still not yet priced into many of these investment decisions. And I think it's worth noting that the physical risks of climate change will be all the more severe the less financing is provided for poorer countries. So where do we really go from here? I mean, in high-income countries, as we've mentioned a bit, and as I think we'll be saying later, there is a big role for government regulation in bringing the long horizons kind of closer to us. And climate-focused regulation will also happen in poorer economies. We will also see some spillovers from regulation from developed countries into poorer countries. And I think the carbon border adjustment mechanism from the EU is a good example here. But I think more generally speaking, many poorer countries just do not have the same tools at their disposal when it comes to regulation. And instead, many countries will simply be relying on sustainable finance flows from richer to poorer countries. And it's these flows that can make action happen now, not later. So I think it's, in general, it's quite clear that we need to scale up the supply of sustainable finance for poorer countries. How we do it is much, much harder. I personally think that there may be an opportunity here for the public sector and the private sector to come together, with the public sector acting to de-risk some of the key investments and crowd in the private investment, and hopefully making sure that we don't end up in a situation where we end up, privatizing all the gains and socializing all the losses. But on the other hand, I think we also need to work on increasing the demand for these investments. And this means supporting poorer countries and kind of creating the necessary conditions on the ground to prepare more bankable project pipelines. And here, the role of development institutions and donors is even more crucial. So yeah, none of this is easy. None of it even sounds easy. And I don't think there are any really easy solutions here, but the current situation is inadequate, and sustainable finance, including sustainable finance from private sources, will be very key here. Thank you.
Thank you, Alina, for your explanations. Very interesting, and they show that the challenge is not the same for every country, every region in the world, and it depends a lot on the economic situation. So But as we've heard from Thierry and also Stefano and Christophe, one of the challenge seems to be to define what is sustainable investment, where to draw the line between sustainable and normal investment. So now I would like to turn to Jean-Philippe. The lack of a common language seems to be a problem, and it may fuel greenwashing. In this respect, does the European taxonomy, which was mentioned previously, bring some clarity and coherence on what can be labeled sustainable finance? Jean-Philippe. You're muted, Jean-Philippe.
Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Virgile. And first, let me thank Observatoire de la Finance for the opportunity and the honor to join this fascinating debate. Quick few words first on the terms of the equation. Tragedy of horizons, plural, by the way. It refers to decision-making horizons, first in the private sector, but also in the public sector, governments, versus the horizon of the physical climate risks that are the result of the greenhouse gas emissions, at least are assumed to be the result of the greenhouse gas emissions that we've been throwing at the atmosphere for the last 150 years. Okay, it's not only about short-term preference of investors, even if there is, that's a big part of it. And it's not necessarily either about moral values, or rather you can put it in different terms. When you start talking about moral values, it's to put it to be absolutely down to earth and practical. I'll echo what Stefano was saying. The climates are changing all around the world in different ways. There's going to be different impacts. And the end, it might even come faster and much faster than expected, because we are structurally tending to underestimate the pace of the change. The point here is we know it's going to get worse, harsher conditions, less livable, not necessarily impossible to live, but extremely disagreeable, with all sorts of social, economic disruptions, water shortages, 50 degrees in areas where, you typically used to have what was called Mediterranean climates, things like that. That's going to cause huge, as Stefano was saying, not only conflicts, but massive movements of population also. Do we want to live in that kind of world in 30 years? And that's irrespective of values, human rights, whatever. Or let's put it differently, those are, of course, part of it. The answer is no, for everyone, I guess, regardless of what your personal beliefs might be. Nobody wants to live in a climate where there's 50 degrees in the shade and, floods 4 times a year. Pretty obvious. Now, what can you do to avoid that? The issue is trying to limit greenhouse gas emissions, bearing in mind, and there I don't want to be pessimistic, that the climate changes for the next 10 years are already locked in. In other words, they will result from the emissions that are already in the atmosphere. So you're trying to limit the damage, in other words. What can we do to limit the damage? And that's where all the tools the jargon, sustainable finance, reorienting finance, regulating, etc., comes in. The problem is, why do you need those regulations? Well, you need those regulations because given the, goal that everyone I mean, nobody can disagree, at least openly, to the fact that we don't want to destroy or damage anymore the world we live in. So everybody is going to claim to be green, and everybody is going to be claimed to do sustainable finance, whether they really are or not. Point here is, well, just a little anecdote. A few weeks ago, because I wanted to make a number of little changes in a few investments I had, I did a little tour and went to see a number of investment managers and had a close look at some of their funds and what exactly was in them. They all had various green labels and I'm greener than you are, whatever. In more than half of them, there was more than a third, sometimes even half or more of, technological stocks in them. Google, Apple, whatever, Why? Because that boosts performance. That was what gave them the performance. So there's a tension between the need to have the performance, the returns, if you prefer, and the need to, for commercial reasons, whether they really believe in it or not, live up to what are increasingly getting or increasingly becoming the expectations: sustainable finance, green finance, etc. And that's where we come to the second part, which is your question, the need for a common language. Yes, definitely, but it's not only a common language, it's a common standard. And a common standard means several things. Then, well, one is common standard, common language to be able to compare and contrast the investments, both from the point of view of the market investor, but also from the point of view of the bank, to be able to select the exposures it wants to lend to or not, and price them according to the risks, with climate risks being one of them. That means you need to be able to quantify your risk, which is slightly difficult in terms of climate risk. We're not there yet. Last thing also, if you really want to have common language and common standards, then certainly the European taxonomy is more than welcome, but you need to understand that it's a classification system. That's what the word taxonomy means. In other words, it's a first step. The agents then, whether, and in particular, whether the asset managers or the banks, then need to go a step further on their own. Because in a taxonomy, in a classification system, you just bunch together a number of entities that have the same characteristic, the same sector, and therefore, on average, you'll consider they have the same emissions or the same risk. In other words, in practice, that's not true. You're going to have some that are much more efficient than others, and some that are much worse than others. So to be able to risk differentiate, then you have to go, and that's what we are now requiring or starting to require banks to do. And I'm referring to guidance, which has been published for consultation by the Basel Committee a couple of weeks ago on risk management. It's, well, in other areas, we call it know your customer. That means price in all the risk and not only the risk that is visible here, now, straight away. And if you can't price it in, because it's extremely difficult, then make a decision as whether you're going to take the risk or not. And if you take it, whether you're going to mitigate it or not, how you're going to manage it. Last thing also, if we're really talking about standards, and if we're talking about the European taxonomy becoming perhaps something more than just a tool for disclosures, then there are going to be a number of tricky issues. Two things here. One, to what extent it can be implemented by firms, in other words, by the banks themselves in the financial sector, or by the insurance firms themselves. And then there's a whole set of, how would I say, tricky implementation issues that need to be ironed out. In terms of, things called scope 3 emissions. How do you measure the emissions down and up your value chain? How am I going to know what is the emissions of the customer of my customer? Not easy. Second thing, it's going to be the enforcement. If you want to avoid greenwashing, if you want everybody to be comparable, then they all need to comply. And they won't necessarily all comply willingly, especially if it's against their short-term interests. So you'll have to be able to enforce it. And that's what probably is coming in the European Union. Now, having said that, you only have a standard for the European Union, not for the rest of the world. So then you have to start thinking about having some kind of common tariffs outside on the borders of the Union. And that's where the carbon scheme comes into play, to be able to make sure that there's a level playing field and that firms competing with firms in the European Union are not put at or do not have an unfair competitive advantage. Sorry, I'll stop here. I've been too long.
Oh, thank you, Jean-Philippe. You've made some very important points. Thank you. So we've seen some of the issues and some of the problems with this tragedy of horizon. We've talked about paradigm, taxonomy. Also, we had some views for southern economies, developing economies. Now I would like to shift the discussion to the solutions. What kind of solutions in terms of instrument regulations, that approaches that we could imagine to overcome this tragedy of horizons. So I will start with a question to you, Christophe. The standard approach to environmental problems in economics has been to define the latter as negative externalities. It's time that we change this approach to ensure that markets internalize this externality. Would carbon pricing be a first step in this direction? Could it contribute to overcome the tragedy of horizons? Christophe.
Thank you, Virgile, for your question. So I think it's a first stone on the road, but it's insufficient to my opinion. It's a first stone because it fixes a price for carbon and it asks to pay the cost of emissions that we produce. So that could be considered as a good point as we define the cost for nature. Considering that charging users the full environmental cost of fossil fuel products could be one method. So clearly we could consider this way, that could be a first stone. But to me, it's insufficient because of two main problems and two main issues. First, how is fixed the price of carbon? On what basis? It could be a question. And the second one, if you don't want to lower your emissions, you have the possibility to continue emitting, but you have to pay for that. And that's clearly not sufficient to fix, to me, the sustainable issues. Because in doing that, we promote emissions and we favor extractions of fossil resources. So if we consider, to me, considering strong sustainability goes further. Okay, so the deal to me is to stop emitting. That's the only way we have if we want to reach the 1.5 degree objective in 2100. And finally, we do the same things as for tobacco. If you look at tobacco, you can say it's bad to smoke, but if you have money, you can smoke if you want. Or it's the same for drugs. You can take drugs, but if you have money, you can do that. So it's bad to do that, but if you have money, you can pay, you can do that. And it's the same for polluting activities. You can say that you can take the plane every day if you want. You can eat your home with coal. You can consume on Black Fridays as you want, but until the moment you can pay, that's not a problem. Okay, so I think that the problem is that it's a good step to say that we want to go in this way, but I think it's insufficient. Good step could be to say that we remove the possibility to pay for anything. Okay, so it's totally paradoxical also to say we have to pay for carbon, and finally fund in the other way, on the other side, the fossil fuel companies with public subsidies, for example, that represent close to $6 trillion in 2020. So just by encouraging energy waste and environmental and social destruction, we know that energy subsidies also finally exacerbate the vulnerability of countries and consumers to the volatility of energy prices, as it mainly generally, as last study published by the IMF in 2021, as it mainly benefits generally to 20% of richest households in the world. So we know that it's unfair, and it's not specifically well embedded. So it shows finally that the issue of sustainability to me cannot be monetized, matched with a price signal, finally, that doesn't reflect the real price of the politics sector. So we know that carbon pricing today is cheaper than renewables because of the unfair concurrence of liquidity distributed to fossil fuel companies, and to maintain finally the paradigm that we described just before of a fossil energy world. Okay, so to me, carbon pricing, it's a first step, but it's a tool also for financial actors because of the pricing finally and the possibility to trade emissions. And finally, coming back to the stock market rules and paradigm. So it's like when we can do differently finally when considering that markets are everywhere, and we can do without doing what markets do every day. So I prefer to my own theory saying that you can't extract, and whether you do that, you are condemned and sanctioned to such a level that you finally will think twice the next time. Okay, so it means that I think that we have to be sure that the regulation in this way is really hard, is really straining, and to me, it's the only way to solve the problem. I think that if we authorize companies to pay for carbon, it means that we don't prevent the fact that we have to avoid extraction and to finally to prevent this stuff. So just to conclude, if we consider that the question is to say, can we consider that carbon pricing prevents new fossil fuel projects or extraction? Clearly, the question is no. The answer is no. We can consider that it's not totally efficient. Maybe to propose one solution could be to promote massively, in my perspective, sustainable finance until the moment, of course, we have a clear taxonomy. It's to promote massively sustainable finance from a public standpoint, considering that if we remove bond subsidies, we can do in a clear plan or a clear schedule. We can support on the other side in the same amount the SDGs or sustainable activities. So it's more, to me, a political question and a choice than a real question of practices and method finance.
Thank you, Christophe. Sorry. So if carbon pricing is not sufficient to mitigate climate change, I'll turn to Stefano. What other instruments or what other policy mix, probably we need a combination of different instruments or measures, could contribute to break this tragedy of horizon? Stefano, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so let me first say there is a broad consensus, I think, among economists on the fact that a carbon price is useful, but there is no consensus on whether it can be sufficient. And Christophe pointed out some of the issues. Some other issues are essentially related to, I think, the reality of policies. First of all, reaching a global agreement on a carbon tax is not easy because the national interests are not necessarily aligned. And then there is the details of the implementation of a carbon tax. We've seen some attempts in the past. If the costs are passed on to consumers, then you have a backlash by general population. So we have been talking about a carbon tax for 30 years, and it's not clear at all that we can afford to wait to have one. So what else can be done? And I think we can group the complementary instruments into two. One is about signaling, one is about regulation. And the actors that we can think of being the origin of these two activities are, on the one hand, governments, and on the other hand, financial authorities. So governments. Well, first of all, keep in mind that anything that is to do with development of infrastructure historically, and in reality, you know, out of the economic textbooks, has always been, in a way or another, to some level, accompanied, I would say, maybe not directed by governments. The development of highways or railways or the energy infrastructure since the beginning of the 20th century in all countries, including the United States, you know, regardless of the type of political structure of the government, has always been encouraged or by governments. So governments can signal, in this case, with respect to the low carbon transition, they can signal the commitment to mitigate climate change by means of long-term economic policies. And by that, I mean fiscal policies, but also in the sense of investments, for instance, in renewable energy, for instance, but also financial policies. And that has to do with ending subsidies to fossil fuel and considering or continuing subsidies into low carbon activity for a while during the transition. There is also regulation, as I think as Christoph said, on emissions. Think of in the car industry, the way we have been going from, you know, Euro 1 to Euro 6 and reduced, and the quality of the air in European cities has been as much improved, not because of a price on the pollutants, and in particular the particulate that is coming from the car exhaustion, but it's because of regulation. It's just simply say you can't do that, period. And that at some point that is a solution. It has worked. In the same way in which you forbid chemical industries to release hazardous chemicals in rivers. It's not in those cases the solution is not a price or a tax. It's just preventing them to do that. That's sometimes can be much more effective. Coming now to financial authorities, there is and that there's signaling. I think financial authorities can signal the importance and the seriousness of green taxonomies, and the EU taxonomy offers a very, very clear one. It's not perfect, but it's the best we have at the moment. And let me say also that at the University of Zurich, we collaborate with the European Commission to provide a tool that allows to assess the alignment of portfolios to the EU taxonomy. The other kind of signal is the recognition of the nature of climate risk, the importance of climate risk is also its systemic nature. So there is an ongoing debate about introducing climate risk specifically in the macroprudential framework. And that relates to encouraging the assessment of climate-related risk by means in particular of climate stress tests. The European Central Bank is expecting to conduct that on a large set of European banks already in 2022. And at the University of Zurich, we have been already collaborating with some national central banks to conduct such climate stress tests on financial institutions. So to conclude, I think we should be aware there are important challenges in assessing this climate risk. By that I mean the sense of risk measures like expected shortfall, things that are really practical for investors. There's a model uncertainty, there is ambiguity in the agents' probability measures, there is issue of granularity of the data, there is lots of issues. But yet these are not excuses for inaction. I think an important message is that the knowledge, the models and the data that are available today are already sufficient to start addressing seriously the exposure of climate risk to climate risk of portfolios, and more in general going forward to other sustainability issues.
Thank you, Stefano. To continue on the important role of public authorities, not only financial, but public authorities or government in general, I would like to ask a question to Alina. The European Commission is strongly emphasizing the notion of double materiality. Could you explain what it means and why it could have important implications, Alina?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. So materiality when it comes to ESG reporting relates to thinking about how ESG issues, including, for example, climate change, will impact a company's activities and a company's financial situation. But double materiality also includes the other side of this equation. So how the company's activities are impacting the climate and the broader world. And let me demonstrate this based on an example from the EBRD, where I work. So on one end, the EBRD has recently announced that by the end of 2022, all of its investments will be Paris aligned, which means that each transaction will undergo a screening to ensure that the effects the EBRD has on the world are consistent with the temperature goals set out in the Paris Agreement. And our Paris alignment process, and more broadly, the impacts of our transactions, are reported on in the EBRD Sustainability Report. On the other end, like many other organizations, the EBRD also publishes a Tcfd report. And the Tcfd report focuses on the risks and opportunities created by climate change, which impact the bank's ability to serve its clients in the long run. And double materiality really fills this entire space in between, from thinking about Paris alignment to reporting on the risks and opportunities. And I think it extends the idea of responsibility to shareholders to also incorporate responsibility to stakeholders. I think in general, how we think about materiality has really been fast evolving. I get the impression that initially the focus with ESG disclosures was very much on reporting on companies' impacts on the environment, on the broader world. But more recently, as we've all come to realize just how severe the physical and transition risks of climate change will be, we are increasingly reporting on those risks. And this drove the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, and more recently during the COP, the International Sustainability Standards Board from the IFRS Foundation. But now, as you say, particularly in Europe, we're hearing a lot about how the TCFD view of materiality may no longer be sufficient. And in Europe, there's been a big push to include double materiality in reporting for both corporations and financial institutions. And I think this just points to how quickly our understanding of these topics is changing, and also what a difficult role companies have in kind of understanding how to best do the reporting. Now, Virgil, you also asked me about the implications of this. And to be honest, I think very much depends on whether we embrace double materiality or not. I think single materiality will help us prepare for what's coming. But quite crucially, double materiality could also help us take some steps to mitigate the severity of what's coming. And for this reason, I personally am quite a fan of the double materiality approach. I think it'll be interesting to watch this double materiality space and see whether it takes off.
Thank you, Alina. I would like also to hear Thierry about this notion of double materiality, because it's an initiative from the European Commission. But Thierry, do you think it could become, there could be an international consensus on this notion? Is it likely to become an international standard, or are there strong divergences on this notion, Thierry?
Game is happening as we're talking, literally. Alina just defined very well, what is at stake. And if I can put it in perfectly compatible but slightly different words, we're talking about, outside in financial materiality. In other words, what's the impact of the socio-environment on the cash flows of the company? That's single materiality. And double materiality is that financial materiality plus inside out environmental materiality. In other words, impact of companies on the outside world. Clearly the focus, the international focus since Tcfd really has been on financial materiality. What's the impact of the environment on the companies? And that has led to Tcfd, and then there were, a lot of initiative, backed by Bloomberg, let's call a spade, SASB, Sustainable Accounting Standard Board, and also very importantly supported by BlackRock, which we know is the biggest asset manager in the world. In January 2020, so almost 2 years ago, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, wrote to all the CEOs of the planet. And when you're BlackRock, you're managing so many thousands of billions of dollars. Effectively, at the end of the day, to make longer story short, you're invested in every single company that's listed out there in the world. And he wrote to all the CEOs of listed companies saying, please adopt the SASB standards for sustainability reporting. And SASB works on the logic, is founded on single materiality. Fine. So you have the biggest asset manager putting pressure on listed companies, basically all of them, saying use single materiality. And then you have the EU that says, look, of course, financial materiality, single materiality is indispensable. It's very important. You need to understand your risks. But this is all still, and that goes back to what number of things that Christophe and Stefano said earlier. That's still in the logic of finance as it is today. What's the financial impact of if we take just climate change, but obviously the issue is broader than climate change, has on companies. And double materiality takes also the other dimension, which is what's the impact on the company on the world. And clearly the EU since 2017 started introducing this. In 2019, there were some non-binding guidance on climate reporting. And now we have on the table, a so-called corporate sustainability reporting directive, not adopted, but it's on the table. It's been proposed by the Commission that makes makes a very clear case for embedding double materiality in the process. And as we know, there's a body linked to the European Commission called EFRAG, working on developing sustainability standards today in the EU. It will be sort of, the technical criteria behind the corporate sustainability reporting directive, and EFRAG is working on the basis of double materiality. And very importantly, and I would like to emphasize that, to insist on something that Alina touched upon. During the COP26, we had that big announcement that we have an international sustainability standards board that is being created under the auspices of the IFRS Foundation. And that is working on a single materiality concept. So let's make a long story short. We have two visions of the world. We have two conceptions. One is the TCFD, IFRS, ISSB, Bloomberg, very important players, BlackRock, block saying single materiality. The other one is the European Union / EFRAG work saying double materiality. In an ideal world, the two would be compatible because double materiality by definition as a concept embeds single materiality. It's just, there's another dimension. In practice, and obviously well-known sentence, devil is in detail, do you have the right standards that are compatible, and can the two speak to each other and be integrated in each other? This is huge work. Frankly, I'm not seeing that huge a huge willingness to cooperate internationally. I'm seeing more competing standards, which makes me very, very worried, because obviously, to me, it's obvious that double materiality is the only thing that will make a difference. Because when you think about it, there's a link between the two. You know, if a company feeds and it's not if, as companies, the world economy feeds the fact that the world is not sustainable, then that lack of sustainability of the world will hit back on companies' accounts and cash flows as a second step, I would say, in a second round. So the two are intimately linked. So if we want to, it's all very well to assess what the impact of the lack of sustainability of the world will be on the cash flows of a company, but if you're not able to assess what the company is doing to the lack of sustainability of the world, then you're missing absolutely an essential dimension. So at the end of the day, you know, this discussion we're having today is under what circumstances can sustainable finance make a difference? Well, the answer is that if it doesn't take into account environmental materiality inside out, it will miss on, maybe it will measure the impact of the lack of sustainability on the world on the accounts of companies, but it will not be able to address it. So this is very, very fundamental. And yes, we can be concerned, and we should be pushing and cooperating to make sure that the whole spectrum is embedded in the discussions.
Thank you, Thierry. So we'll see what will be the outcome of the struggle between those two concepts and conceptions of single materiality on one hand and double materiality on the other. So I'd like to turn now to Jean-Philippe about traditional risk management approaches. They are probably unsuitable for measuring climate change related risks, because these risks are expected to materialize over a much longer time horizon. Therefore, now we have public authorities who have turned to stress tests to assess the extent of firms' vulnerability to climate change. Jean-Philippe, you have recently co-signed an interesting study on the topic with one of your colleagues at the BIS. How could stress tests facilitate a transition for the banks to a lower carbon economy? And what are the challenges for banks?
Two things. First, I don't know if there's really an opposition between, or if we can even say that risk management approaches are unsuitable, because those happens to be the ones we're still using. Stress test is not a new technique. Scenario analysis was used and developed by large corporates in the early 70s, which happened to be the major oil companies when oil prices were getting volatile and couldn't be determined anymore according to the usual supply demand. You couldn't determine the price in that way because, of course, there were political factors coming into it. Same thing nowadays for scenario analysis, meaning what is called the old scenario analysis is nothing more than a fallback option that you use when you can't do straight modeling. Because for all sorts of uncertainties, starting with the climate effects themselves, you can come up with a number, but you don't know how off the mark your number might be. You don't know what is the interval of confidence of your number. There's, well, all sorts of uncertainties, let's say. And you can't even quantify the amount of uncertainty that you have around your estimate. Meaning, until you've solved those problems, you can't really use your climate risk scenarios to do stress testing according to the regulatory definition of stress tests, American, let's say, Federal Reserve version, to determine regulatory capital requirements. You can't do that, and certainly not at a 30-year horizon, and end up by telling the bank, you are X billion short of capital, or you've got just about the right amount, because it's uncertain. Essentially, if you do that, what you are doing in reality, you are determining capital requirements based on the assumptions you've designed for your model, meaning it's not risk-based. You really can't justify it. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that those scenario analysis or stress tests or macroprudential stress tests, as they're also being called, of the type that has already been referred to, that the ECB is going to conduct next year. They've already done one. The French authorities have also done one. The British authorities are doing one. Altogether, there are about 18 countries that are in the process of developing such stress tests. What is it? It's a risk assessment tool. It's to identify the risks, see what types of climate risks you are confronted, your banking system or your financial system is facing, where it's located. You know, there are two big things that matter in terms of climate risk: location of the exposure, sector of exposure. And it matters for both physical and for transition risks. And once you've done that, then you try and move to the second step and see ballpark number, how big is the risk? But coming up with a precise measure, how big is the risk? The other thing also that we might be focusing on, and there might be a need to focus upon, is enriching the scenarios. Because for the moment, the climate scenarios, they're being enriched every year, by the way. The ones that are used by the new scenarios published, for instance, by the Network for Greening the Financial System, the NGFS, are already an improvement on the ones that were used previously. Why? What is the problem? Well, essentially, the scenarios are incomplete already at the climate level. They're incomplete, meaning that they are very likely to underestimate the risk. And that's, of course, a topic that Stefano knows probably much better than me, since it's about interactions and cumulative effects. The scenarios that they're currently written do not take or assess well into account the extreme weather events that may be occurring. They are essentially based on a gradual rise in temperature, you know, the 1.5 targets, the 2 targets, and based on emissions. They also contain huge simplifying assumptions. All the policy measures we were talking about and that Stefano mentioned, they are reflected by a single proxy, which is a shadow carbon price. Needless to say, that can hide a huge number of diverse applications or diverse policy mixes, which is in fact what we are seeing in reality. And why are they diverse policy mixes? Well, you know, no two country is affected by the same climate changes. No two country has the same policy mix. No two country has the same economy. And it doesn't have the same government either, by the way. So they're all going to come up with different measures. Last here, but not the least, those scenarios analysis or those exercises are being conducted with the respective banking industries, including the exercise which the ECB is going to do. And for the time being, at least, it's a learning exercise on both cases, on both sides. And it's an opportunity to not only identify the risk and see if and how and to what extent you can measure, but it's also part of, how would I say, a long road towards filling in all the data gaps and data insufficiencies. There are lots and lots of them, and they're not the same. You know, for instance, a few years ago, perhaps 20 or 30, we used to be able to say, okay, if there's been a hurricane in this area in the Caribbean, now I'm fine until next year. No longer true. Now you can have two, the same place, the same year. That's what's been happening, for instance, in the Bahamas. So you can't predict. And the point here is you can't use past data as to project future potential losses. So you got no usable data, essentially. And you have to find a way to be able to solve that. Otherwise, your modeling is just going to be the result of your assumptions. So lots and lots of work to do here. And the challenges for the banks, well, for the moment, they just about, and even that is not quite perhaps finished, reached and more or less completed the risk identification stage. And now they're trying, but it's an enormous amount of work and effort, portfolio by portfolio, to assess the main risk drivers of each kind of portfolio. And it's not the same thing whether you're looking at residential mortgages or, I don't know, you know, the car industry or tourism. You're not exposed to the same climate factors. And it's also a question of location. Huge work underway that you don't generally hear about.
Thank you very much, Jean-Philippe. We have reached already the end of our session here about the tragedy of horizons. So thank you very much to all for your insights and explanation and your availability. It was a very exciting discussion and very enriching. Before we close the session, I would like to reiterate the fact that we at the Observatoire de la Finance we organize a prize for young people under 35 on ethics and trust in finance, who Alina Meka participated on the 8th edition, which is just which we have just closed now, and we're going to launch the 9th edition beginning of next year. And also, I would like to say that we at the Observatoire, we publish a newsletter every month, which is called From Virus to Vitamin, and we invite experts and academics to answer a question every month. So I will invite you all, our guest speakers, to participate to the next edition, which we will be probably on the question of the tragedy of horizons. I will keep you posted on that, but it's a very short answer of 120 words, and then we write an editorial on the basis of your answers. So thank you for your insights, and we will be in touch for the follow-up of this session. And thank you to all of you for attending this session. Yeah, we will be in touch. The Observatoire is based in Geneva, so we'll be happy to stay in touch. If you'd like to receive our newsletter, you can also give me your email address. We'll be happy to include you in the network of the Observatoire. So thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.